Dust coats the back of your throat before you even see Bitter Creek. Gideon hated the settlement. He hated the stench of unwashed bodies, masked by cheap lilac water, the rattle of poorly greased wagon wheels, the nervous, empty chatter of folks who didn't know how to survive a winter. He came down from the high ridge twice a year. Salt, lead, coffee. This time he figured on leaving with 50 pounds of dry goods. He didn't figure on a woman. Boot heels struck the splintered boardwalk with a hollow, tired rhythm. Gideon stopped outside Hiram's Provisions, resting his hand on the rough timber of the supporting post. The wood felt damp, rotting from the bottom up. He breathed in, filtering the smells of the street mule dung, stale beer, lye soap, and the sharp metallic tang of slaughterhouse runoff from the edge of town. It made his stomach tight. 6 months in the high pines bleached a man's palate, making the chaos of human habitation feel like an assault. He pushed through the warped bat-wing doors of the mercantile. The bell above chimed a weak, pathetic note. Inside, the air was suffocatingly close, smelling of cured tobacco, rancid bacon grease, and old wool. Gideon walked heavy. He didn't try to quiet his steps. He carried 3 heavy bundles of prime winter pelts slung over his left shoulder, the weight of the dead animals grounding him. Hiram, a man whose skin looked like boiled dough, stood behind the counter. His small eyes darted to the furs, a greasy sheen of calculation washing over his face. Gideon didn't speak. He unceremoniously dropped the bundles onto the counter. A cloud of dust and microscopic hairs puffed into the air. "Good season?" Hiram asked, his voice a wheeze. Gideon just stared. He hated the ritual of words. 50 pounds of flour, 20 of salt. Coffee whatever you have that ain't half chicory. 10 pounds of sugar, 2 bricks of lead. Hiram nodded, his fingers already picking at the bindings of the pelts, greedy to assess the beaver and fox. That was when the noise from the back room bled through the thin partition. It wasn't a scream. A scream would have been easy to ignore. Screams meant panic, and panic belonged to fools. This was a low, desperate sound. The scraping of a heavy boot against floorboards, a sharp intake of breath, a heavy thud. Gideon kept his eyes on Hiram, but the merchant looked away, suddenly very interested in the stitching of a beaver pelt. "Your back room," Gideon said, his voice grating like 2 river stones. "Nothing that concerns a man from the ridge." Hiram muttered, not looking up. "Just settling a ledger." Gideon didn't care about ledgers. He didn't care about town justice or who owed what. But a sudden sharp crash of glass echoed from the back, followed by a heavy wet slap. Gideon's jaw tightened. He turned away from the counter, his heavy coat brushing the flour barrels, and walked to the curtained doorway. He pulled the stained fabric aside. The back room smelled of spilled kerosene and sweat. A large man, heavy around the middle, wearing a dirty canvas duster, had a woman backed against a stack of crates. He had her by the hair. Her head was yanked back, exposing the pale skin of her throat. She wasn't crying. That was the first thing Gideon noticed. Her eyes were wide, the color of bruised slate, but they were dry. She was gripping a broken neck of a whiskey bottle in her right hand, her knuckles white blood trickling down her wrist where she had sliced herself, breaking it. "Drop it, Clara!" The heavy man grunted, his breath visible in the dim, chilly room. "Your uncle owed me $40. He's dead. The debt ain't. You can work it off on your back at the saloon, or you can come quiet." Clara swallowed hard. Her chest heaved. "I'll bleed you out right here, Miller." Miller laughed, a wet, ugly sound, and raised his other hand to strike her again. Gideon didn't think about it. If he thought about it, he would have walked back out, grabbed his flour, and headed up the mountain. Instead, his hand dropped to the heavy iron of the Colt on his hip. He didn't draw it. He just let his thumb rest loudly on the hammer. Click. The metallic sound cut through the room like a physical blade. Miller froze. He turned his head slowly, his grip on Clara's hair loosening just a fraction. "Let her go," Gideon said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "This is town business, mountain man." Miller spat, though his eyes darted nervously to the Colt. She's property to a debt. I said let her go. Gideon stepped into the room. He smelled of pine pitch wood smoke and dried blood. He was a foot taller than Miller, with shoulders built from chopping wood and dragging carcasses through snowdrifts. Miller weighed his odds, let out a curse, and shoved Clara back against the crates. He held his hands up, taking a wide step around Gideon. "Hiram gets to explain this to the sheriff," he muttered, sliding past the curtain and out into the store. Gideon didn't watch him go. He looked at the woman. Clara. She was breathing hard, slowly lowering the broken bottle. Her dress was faded calico patched at the elbows. Her hands were rough, calloused from labor. There was a red mark blooming on her cheekbone. She didn't thank him. She just wiped her bleeding wrist on her apron, her eyes locking onto his. They were hard eyes. Pragmatic. "He'll come back with 3 men. She said, her voice raspy and dry. "And the sheriff is his cousin." Gideon stared at her. "Not my problem. I came for salt." He turned to leave. "Wait." He stopped, irritated by the sound of her voice, irritated by the slight tremble she was trying to hide. "Take me with you," she said. Gideon looked back over his shoulder. He frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. "I live at 10,000 feet. It snows in June. I don't have a floor, just packed dirt. You'd be dead in a week. I'm dead here by sundown." Clara countered flatly. She stepped away from the crates, dropping the broken glass. It shattered further on the floorboards. "I can cook. I can skin a rabbit. I won't complain." Gideon looked at her hands again. Not a lady. A worker. Someone who knew misery. He hated this town. He hated the way it trapped people in its rot. He walked back into the main store. Hiram was sweating behind the counter. $40, Gideon said, pointing to the furs. "Take it out of the Prime Beaver. Clear her uncle's ledger. Give me my supplies." Hiram opened his mouth to argue, saw the dead flat look in Gideon's eyes, and quickly reached for his account book. Gideon turned back to the curtain. Clara was standing there, clutching a small, worn carpet bag. She had been ready to run for days. "Grab the coffee," Gideon said. "We ride in 10 minutes. Bitter Creek faded behind them, swallowed by the rolling dust and the scrub oak, but the stench of it seemed to cling to Gideon's coat for miles. He rode his heavy roan gelding, leading the 2 pack mules. Clara rode the smaller mule, perched precariously atop a sack of oats and bundled canvas. They hadn't spoken since leaving the mercantile. The silence wasn't companionable. It was thick-heavy with the immediate crushing weight of reality. Gideon felt a sour knot of regret tightening in his gut. He was a solitary creature. He knew the rhythms of the wind, the migration of elk, the exact way damp cedar caught a spark. He did not know what to do with a woman riding behind him, shivering in a thin wool shawl as the elevation climbed. The trail narrowed, cutting into the side of the mountain. The scrub oak gave way to towering ponderosa pines. The air cooled dramatically, biting at exposed skin. Gideon listened to the steady clop thud of the hooves. He waited for her to complain. He waited for the tears, the questions, the inevitable realization that she had made a terrible mistake. He glanced back. Clara was gripping the ropes of the pack saddle, her knuckles raw. Her face was pale lips, slightly blue in the mountain chill, but she wasn't looking down at the steep drop-off. She was looking dead ahead, her jaw set in a stubborn, unyielding line. She caught him looking, and met his gaze, her expression blank. Gideon faced forward again, irritated. He kicked the roan into a slightly faster walk. By dusk, the cold was a physical presence, slipping under their clothes like icy water. They reached a small, natural clearing sheltered by a rocky overhang. "Get down!" Gideon grunted, swinging out of his saddle. Clara clumsily slid off the mule, her legs giving out for a second when her boots hit the uneven ground. She caught herself on the animal's flank, stifling a wince. The long ride without a proper saddle had bruised her deeply. Gideon ignored her struggle. If he coddled her, she'd expect it. "Gather dead wood. Nothing green, nothing wet. Don't go past the tree line." He turned his back, focusing on unhitching the mules and stripping the packs. When he finished hobbling the animals, he turned around. Clara was dragging a massive dead pine branch into the clearing. It was far too heavy for her, her boots slipping in the pine needles, but she hauled it relentlessly toward the fire ring. She dropped it, breathing heavily, rubbing the sap from her raw hands onto her skirt. "More?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly from the dry air. "That'll do." Gideon took his hatchet and made quick work of the wood. Within minutes, a small, efficient fire was eating away at the dry bark, throwing harsh, flickering light against the rock wall. The smell of burning pine chased away the lingering ghost of the town. He handed her a tin cup of water and a piece of hardtack. "Eat." Clara took it. She didn't complain about the rock-hard bread. She dipped it in the water, softened it, and chewed methodically. Gideon sat on a rotting log across the fire, cleaning his rifle out of habit, though it didn't need it. He watched her through the rising smoke. The firelight caught the bruising on her cheek where Miller had struck her. In the harsh light, she looked older, worn down to the bone. "You didn't ask my name," she said quietly, staring into the flames. "Heard him call you Clara." Gideon replied, not looking up from the rifle action. "Clara Miller." She corrected her voice, carrying a bitter edge. "He was my husband's brother." Gideon paused, the oiled rag going still over the steel barrel. He hadn't expected that. He didn't want a backstory. Backstories were messy. "Husband died of the cholera 3 months back." Clara continued, as if talking to the fire rather than him. "Left me with a piece of dirt that wouldn't grow weeds and a debt to Miller for the seed. Miller decided taking the farm wasn't enough to cover the interest." She finally looked up at him. "I don't know who you are. I don't know if you're worse than him. But I know you didn't look at me like a piece of meat in that store. You looked at me like an inconvenience." Gideon set the rifle down. "You are an inconvenience." A short, humorless breath escaped her lips, almost a laugh. "I appreciate the honesty." "I don't have a bed for you." Gideon set his voice hard, trying to establish the bleakness of her new reality. "I sleep on a hide. You'll sleep on a hide. When it hits 30 below, the cold gets into your bones and stays there until May. I trap. I hunt. I don't talk much. You'll be alone in a cabin for days when I run the lines. I've been alone in a crowded town for 3 months." Clara said softly, pulling the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I can handle the cold." Gideon stared at her for a long moment. He saw the tremble in her fingers, the exhaustion pooling under her eyes. She was terrified, but she was forcing the fear down into a tight, dark box inside herself. He respected that. He didn't want to, but he did. He stood up, walked over to the supply packs, and pulled out a heavy, thick buffalo robe. He tossed it across the fire. It landed at her feet with a heavy, muffled thud. "Wrap up in that," he ordered, turning away to roll out his own bedroll on the cold ground. "We climb another 3,000 feet tomorrow. We ride at first light." He lay down, turning his back to the fire, and to her. For a long time, the only sounds were the popping of the sap in the fire and the distant mournful howl of a coyote. Then he heard the heavy rustle of the buffalo robe and a faint trembling intake of breath. Gideon closed his eyes, the smell of wood smoke filling his lungs. He had come down for 50 pounds of dry goods. He had a feeling this winter was going to be the heaviest he had ever carried. Frost clung to the mule's whiskers by midday. The trail had vanished beneath a jagged incline of scree and loose shale, forcing Gideon to dismount and lead the roan by the bridle. He didn't look back to check on Clara. If she fell, he would hear the clatter of rocks. If she froze, she'd simply stop moving. That was the law of the ridge. It didn't negotiate with fragile things. The air up here was thin, tasting of ozone and crushed granite. Every breath required deliberate effort. Gideon kept his pace punishingly steady, his long legs eating up the incline while his boots crushed through the crust of early autumn snow. Behind him, the smaller mule snorted in protest, its hooves sliding on the treacherous footing. A sharp, sudden gasp broke the monotonous crunch of snow. Gideon stopped. He turned slowly, expecting to see her weeping or demanding a halt. Clara was pitched forward over the mule's neck, her fingers tangled in the animal's coarse mane. The pack underneath her had shifted violently when the mule stumbled, threatening to dump her down the steep, rocky drop-off to their left. Her face was buried against the mule's rough coat, her shoulders heaving as she fought for oxygen in the high altitude. "Shift your weight right." Gideon ordered, his voice flat. She didn't answer immediately. Her knuckles were bone white. Slowly, agonizingly, she dragged her upper body to the right, leaning into the slope. The mule stabilized, pinning its ears back. Gideon walked back down the few yards separating them. He grabbed the frayed rope securing the canvas sack she was sitting on and yanked it hard, cinching it tight against the iron ring. His knuckles brushed her knee. Through the thin wool of her skirt, she felt like ice. She lifted her head. Her lips were cracked, a thin line of dried blood at the corner of her mouth. Her slate eyes were bloodshot from the biting wind, but they held no plea for mercy. "I can walk," she rasped, her voice barely louder than the wind cutting through the pines. "You'd slow me down," Gideon replied. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He turned his back on her and grabbed the roan's bridle again. "Hold on to the mane. 2 more hours." They breached the timber line as the sun dipped behind the western peaks, casting the world in a bruised violet twilight. The cabin sat nestled in a grove of ancient, lightning-scarred lodgepole pines. It wasn't a home. It was a barricade. Built from thick, unpeeled logs and sealed with mud and dried moss, it squatted against the elements like a stubborn badger. Smoke from the morning's banked fire barely trickled from the stone chimney. Gideon halted the animals. He unbuckled the saddlebags and threw them over his shoulder. "Inside." Clara practically fell off the mule. Her legs crumpled the moment her boots hit the frozen earth. She didn't cry out. She braced her hands against the frozen mud, pushed herself up onto her knees, and then, trembling violently, forced herself to stand. Gideon kicked the heavy wooden door open. The hinges shrieked. Inside it was 10 degrees colder than the wind-battered exterior. The air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of old wood smoke, cured animal fat, and damp earth. There were no windows. A single heavy plank table sat in the center. A cast-iron stove hunkered in the corner like a rusted iron lung. The floor was dirt packed down over years until it felt like stone. In the far corner, a raised wooden platform held a pile of stiff, heavy furs. Clara stood in the doorway, the wind whipping her faded calico skirt around her bruised legs. She looked at the single bed. She looked at the blood-stained butchering block near the stove. She looked at the utter absence of comfort. Gideon struck a match against the doorframe, the sudden sulphurous flare illuminating the harsh lines of his face. He lit a kerosene lantern hanging from a rusted nail. "Shut the door," he said, moving immediately to the stove to revive the coals. "You're letting the wind in." Clara stepped over the threshold. She pushed the heavy timber door shut. The slam echoed in the cramped space, sounding terribly final. She dropped her worn carpetbag onto the dirt. It landed with a pathetic, muffled thud. Gideon didn't offer her a seat. He didn't build up the fire to warm her. He threw 2 chunks of dry, split pine onto the embers, adjusted the damper, and walked out to strip the mules. When he returned an hour later, hauling the heavy sacks of flour and salt, the cabin was marginally warmer. Clara was sitting on the chopping block. She hadn't moved to explore. She hadn't unpacked. She was staring at her hands, which were blistered and raw from the ropes. Gideon dropped the sacks into a wooden bin. He took a tin basin, scooped water from a covered bucket, and set it on the stove to heat. He rummaged in a leather pouch and pulled out a tin of yellowish, strong-smelling salve. He dropped it on the table in front of her. "Pine pitch and bear fat," he muttered. "Rub it in, or your hands will split open by morning." Clara looked at the tin, then up at him. "Thank you." "Don't!" Gideon snapped, turning away to hang his heavy coat. "Infected hands can't chop wood. It's practical. Keep your gratitude." Routine settled like dust in a dry creek bed, heavy grey and impossible to ignore. For the first 3 days they existed in a tense, vibrating silence. Gideon woke before the sun breathing plumes of white vapor into the freezing cabin air. He would find Clara already awake, huddled beneath the buffalo robe, her eyes tracking him in the dark as he built the fire. He didn't give her chores. He simply did what he always did, and left her to figure out her own survival within his walls. On the 4th morning, a blizzard hit. It didn't announce itself with a gentle flurry. It slammed into the ridge with the force of a freight train, rattling the thick logs of the cabin and forcing white powder through the microscopic gaps in the chinking. The wind howled a constant shrieking pitch that scraped against the eardrums. Gideon couldn't check his trap lines. He was caged. He sat at the table, methodically cleaning his colt, breaking it down to the springs and pins, wiping them with an oiled rag. Clara stood near the stove. She had taken to wearing one of his spare wool shirts over her dress. It swallowed her, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. She was making biscuits. Not the hard, tooth-breaking tack Gideon survived on, but actual biscuits. She had found his stash of baking powder, measured out the flour he'd brought from Bitter Creek, and mixed it with water and a dollop of rendered bear fat. Gideon watched her hands. They were stained yellow from the pitch salve, but they moved with a practiced, rhythmic efficiency. Knead, fold, press, cut with the rim of a tin cup. She didn't speak. She just worked. When the cast-iron skillet was hot, she dropped the dough in. The smell hit the air a few minutes later, toasted flour-hot grease, the faint, earthy tang of the bear fat. It was a smell that belonged in a farmhouse kitchen, not a trapper's hovel. It made Gideon's chest feel uncomfortably tight. It smelled like a memory he had spent a decade trying to freeze to death. Clara slid 2 hot biscuits onto a tin plate and set it down next to the disassembled pieces of his revolver. "They're dense," she said, wiping flour from her forehead. "Altitude messes with the rise." Gideon stared at the plate. He picked one up. It burned his fingertips a sharp, grounding pain. He took a bite. It was heavy, greasy, and easily the best thing he had tasted in 6 years. He swallowed, keeping his face entirely blank. "It's edible." Clara gave a short, hard snort. It wasn't a laugh, but it was close. "High praise. Try not to choke on your enthusiasm." Gideon paused, the oiled rag hovering over the cylinder of his gun. He looked up at her. She wasn't shrinking away. She was looking right back at him, challenging him with those bruised, pragmatic eyes. "I prefer quiet." Gideon set his voice a low rumble over the screaming wind outside. "I noticed," Clara replied dryly. She turned her back to him, pouring herself a cup of black coffee. "Good thing I don't need conversation to bake." The tension in the room didn't snap, but it shifted. It stopped feeling like a standoff and started feeling like a negotiation. Later that afternoon, the cabin temperature dropped sharply as the storm intensified. The firewood box near the stove was half empty. Gideon stood up, grabbing his heavy coat and thick leather gloves. "Where are you going?" Clara asked, her voice tight. "You can't see 3 feet out that door. Woodpile is stacked against the south wall," he said, pulling his hat down tight. "Stove goes out, we freeze in 2 hours." He lifted the heavy wooden latch and pulled the door inward. The wind screamed instantly, sucking the warmth from the room and blasting Clara with a spray of fine, icy snow. Gideon slipped out, fighting with all his strength to drag the door shut behind him against the gale. Clara stood alone in the sudden echoing silence of the sealed cabin. The walls felt like they were pressing in. She hated the dark. She hated the isolation. It reminded her too much of the sod house where she had watched her husband turn yellow and die. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Clara paced the short distance between the bed platform and the stove. She threw another of the precious logs into the fire. The wind outside sounded demonic, tearing at the shingles. 30 minutes. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced her chest. If he froze out there, she was dead. She didn't know the mountain. She couldn't chop the massive logs. She was entirely dependent on a man who didn't even want her there. She moved to the door, placing her hands flat against the freezing wood. "Gideon," she whispered. Suddenly, a heavy, wet thump hit the other side of the wood. Clara jerked the latch up and pulled. The wind violently tore the door from her grip, slamming it against the interior wall. Gideon collapsed across the threshold. He was coated in white, a massive, unrecognizable shape of snow and ice. His arms were wrapped around a massive load of split pine, which clattered onto the dirt floor as he fell to his knees. He was gasping, pulling ragged, tearing breaths into his lungs. Clara didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She grabbed him by the collar of his heavy coat and heaved backward, using her entire body weight to drag him fully inside. She let go, rushed back to the door, and threw her shoulder against it, fighting the blinding wind until the heavy iron latch clicked into place. The silence snapped back into the room. Gideon was on his hands and knees, shivering violently, snow melting into muddy pools beneath him. He tried to stand, but his left leg gave out. He cursed a harsh, guttural sound. Clara dropped to her knees beside him. She didn't ask if he was okay. She started unbuttoning his frozen coat with frantic, clumsy fingers. "Get off," he grunted, batting her hands away. "Shut up!" Clara snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. She grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Your fingers are blue, you stubborn fool. Let me help you or I'll leave you to rot right here on the dirt." Gideon stopped fighting. He looked at her. Her face was pale, her hair wild from the wind, but her eyes were entirely steady. He let his arms drop. Clara stripped the frozen coat off him. She hauled him to his feet, ignoring his groan of pain as he put weight on his left side and half-carried, half-dragged him to the stove. She shoved him onto the butchering block. She didn't offer comfort. She offered survival. And as Gideon sat there, watching her violently rub the circulation back into his freezing hands, he realized he had brought a woman up the mountain who was just as hard to kill as he was. Fever took him before midnight. It didn't announce itself with a gentle sweat. It hit him like a physical blow, rattling his teeth and turning his skin to dry parchment. Gideon lay on the raised platform under the heavy firs, his chest hitching with every shallow breath. The cabin was dark, except for the dull orange glow bleeding from the seams of the cast-iron stove. He tried to sit up. His left leg, the one that had given out in the snowdrift, screamed in protest. His hands felt like they were packed in crushed glass. He let out a low, involuntary hiss through his teeth and fell back against the bundled hides he used as a pillow. Clara materialized from the gloom. She held a tin cup. "Drink," she commanded. Her voice lacked any bedside softness. It was the tone of a woman talking to a stubborn draft horse. Gideon turned his head away, his jaw tight. "Leave it. You're burning up and your lungs sound like wet gravel," Clara said, crouching beside the low platform. She didn't wait for permission. She slid a hand behind his neck. Her skin felt shockingly cool against his burning flesh. She forced the rim of the cup against his cracked lips. "Drink it, Gideon, or I'll pour it down your nose." He glared at her, his eyes glassy and unfocused in the dim light, but he opened his mouth. The water was hot and tasted sharply of willow bark, bitter, astringent, and entirely unwelcome. He choked on the first swallow, coughing violently, turning away as a spike of pain drove through his ribs. Clara didn't flinch. She kept her hand firmly behind his neck until the fit passed, then offered the cup again. He finished it, falling back onto the furs, exhausted by the simple act of swallowing. For the next 2 days, the blizzard screamed its fury against the logs, and Clara fought her own war inside. Gideon was a terrible patient. He was a man accustomed to total autonomy, and his sudden dependence galled him. When the fever spiked, he muttered in his sleep. Not words, just low, angry sounds of frustration. When he was lucid, he watched her every move with dark, critical eyes. She ignored his glaring. She had work to do. The division of labor was no longer a negotiation. It was a dictatorship, and she held the reins. She rationed the wood with brutal efficiency, letting the cabin grow uncomfortably cold during the day to ensure they had enough fuel to survive the freezing nights. She broke down the heavy pine rounds using a splitting maul that weighed nearly as much as she did her shoulders, screaming with the effort. On the second afternoon, while Gideon slept heavily, the fever finally breaking, Clara went through his supplies. She needed to know exactly what stood between them and starvation. Behind a stack of flour sacks, she found a wooden crate. Inside were neatly folded canvas tarps, a tin box of spare ammunition, and a smaller carved cedar box. Clara opened it. It didn't hold money or tobacco. It held a delicate silver pocket watch with a shattered glass face, a heavy brass compass, and a small stack of letters bound in rotting twine. The paper was yellowed, the edges crumbling. She didn't untie the twine. She didn't need to read the words to recognize the shape of a buried life. The watch alone was worth more than her uncle's farm. Gideon stirred on the bed. Clara snapped the box shut and shoved it back into the crate, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Looking for something to steal." His voice rasped. Clara stood up, wiping dust from her skirt. She walked to the stove and checked the water basin. "If I wanted to rob you, I would have taken the mules and left you in the snow. I'm looking for dried beans. We need something besides flour and salt." Gideon slowly pushed himself up onto his elbows. The unnatural flush had left his face replaced by a hollow, waxy pallor. He looked at his hands. The tips of his fingers were an angry, mottled purple, but the swelling had gone down. "Bottom of the feed bin." He grunted, nodding toward the corner. "Under the oats, canvas sack." Clara found the beans. She didn't look at the cedar box again. That evening they ate a meager bowl of bean broth and hard biscuits in silence. The wind outside had shifted, losing its shrieking edge and settling into a low, steady moan. The cabin felt heavy, thick with the smell of wood smoke sickness and boiling beans. "Why are you up here?" Clara asked suddenly. She didn't look at him. She stared into her tin bowl, swirling the cloudy broth. Gideon paused his spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked at the woman sitting across from him. Her hair was greasy, her face smudged with soot, and her hands were heavily blistered from the axe handle. She looked exactly like what she was, a survivor. "Towns are crowded," he said finally. "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." He set his bowl down on the butchering block. He picked up his Colt, a habit formed by years of isolation. He checked the action, ignoring the twinge of pain in his stiff fingers. "You handled the wood. You handled the fire. You didn't panic." Clara looked up. She didn't smile. "Panic gets you killed. My husband panicked when the cholera hit. He stopped drinking water. He stopped fighting. He just lay there and waited to die." Gideon met her slate-grey eyes. He saw the cold anger there, not at the disease, but at the surrender. He understood that anger intimately. "I don't wait to die," Gideon said quietly. "Good," Clara replied, picking up her bowl. "Because I'm not digging a grave in frozen dirt." Silence woke him. The crushing, absolute silence of a mountain holding its breath. Gideon opened his eyes. The interior of the cabin was dark, but a thin blade of brilliant, agonizingly bright light pierced through a crack in the doorframe. The wind had stopped. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the platform. His left knee popped loudly, a dull ache radiating up his thigh, but it held his weight. His hands were stiff, the skin dry and peeling around the knuckles, but the deep, bone-aching numbness was gone. Clara's brutal friction massage with the bear fat had saved him from losing fingers. He grabbed his heavy coat and walked to the door. He didn't pull the latch immediately. He leaned his shoulder against the thick wood and pushed. It didn't budge. 4 days of blizzard had packed the snow solid against the eastern wall. He swore under his breath. He turned to grab the short-handled spade resting near the stove, only to find Clara already holding it. She wore his spare wool shirt again, belted at the waist with a piece of rope. She handed him the spade without a word. Gideon took it. He worked the latch open and began hacking at the compacted snow. It was like chipping at solid limestone. It took 20 minutes of grueling, sweat-inducing labor to clear a hole large enough to crawl through. When he finally pushed his way out, the glare of the morning sun off the pristine snow blinded him. He raised a hand to shield his eyes, coughing, as the painfully cold, thin air hit his recovering lungs. The world had been erased. The scrub brush, the jagged rocks, the trail they had taken, all buried beneath 4 feet of blinding white powder. The ponderosa pines sagged under heavy cloaks of snow. The sky was an impossible bruised blue, completely empty of clouds. Clara crawled out behind him. She stood up, sinking to her thighs in the drift. She looked around, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She didn't gasp at the beauty of it. She squinted at the sheer volume of snow. "The mules!" she said, her voice sharp in the still air. Gideon waded toward the lean-to attached to the back of the cabin. The crude structure had held, though the snow was banked almost to the slanted roof. He dug furiously with the spade, tossing heavy clumps of ice and snow over his shoulder. When he breached the entryway, a low, miserable bray greeted him. The mules were alive, huddled together for warmth, the water in their bucket frozen solid. They need water. Gideon rasped, leaning heavily on the spade handle. His chest burned. He had pushed his recovery too fast. "I'll melt snow," Clara said, already turning back toward the tunnel leading into the cabin. "You check your traps. We need meat." He didn't argue. He couldn't. Strapping on his snowshoes was an agonizing process with his stiff fingers. He grabbed his rifle and a burlap sack, leaving the immediate perimeter of the cabin. The snowshoes kept him afloat, but every step was a heavy drag. He checked the first 3 snare lines set close to the tree line. Empty. The storm had kept the animals hunkered deep in their dens. By the time he reached the 4th trap, located near a frozen creek bed, the cold was biting through his heavy wool trousers. A large snowshoe hair hung suspended from a bent sapling, perfectly preserved by the freezing temperatures. It was stiff as a board. Gideon unhooked the wire, dropping the frozen carcass into his sack. It wasn't an elk, but it was fresh protein. He checked 2 more lines, found another hair, and turned back. The exertion had drained him. His vision swam slightly at the edges, the white glare of the snow triggering a throbbing ache behind his eyes. When he reached the cabin, Clara had cleared a wider path to the door and exposed the woodpile. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney. He dropped the burlap sack onto the butchering block inside. The cabin felt incredibly warm compared to the biting cold outside. 2 hares, he said, shrugging off his coat. He watched her. He expected her to balk at the frozen, rigid animals. Most town women wouldn't know where to start. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed a sharp skinning knife from the block. "They're frozen solid. I'll need to thaw them near the stove before I can strip the hide." "You know how to skin." Clara paused, looking at him, as if he had asked a phenomenally stupid question. "I ran a farm for 3 years with a man who couldn't swing an axe without pulling a muscle. I know how to gut a rabbit, Gideon." She picked up the sack and moved it closer to the iron stove, setting it on a piece of canvas. Gideon watched her hands. They were rough-stained and competent. He walked over to the table and sat heavily on the wooden bench, pulling his cleaning kit toward him to wipe the condensation off his rifle. "Miller," Gideon said quietly. The name sounded ugly in the quiet cabin. "He's not a man who lets a debt go." Clara kept her back to him, turning one of the stiff hairs closer to the heat. "No, he isn't. He knows I came from the ridge. He knows you left with me." "He won't come up here," Clara said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Not until the spring thaw. The pass is choked. Nobody comes up the mountain in winter unless they have a death wish." Gideon wiped a thin layer of oil over the gun barrel. "Spring comes eventually." Clara finally turned to look at him. She held the skinning knife in her right hand, the blade catching the dim light of the fire. The bruising on her cheek had faded to a sickly yellow, but the hardness in her eyes was permanent. "Then we have until spring," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Until then, I'll boil your water, I'll skin your rabbits, and I'll keep the fire from dying. But don't expect me to sit around shivering at the thought of a man I already decided to kill." She turned back to the stove. Gideon didn't reply. He carefully set the rifle down. He looked around the cramped, dirt-floored cabin. For the first time in 6 years, the space didn't feel entirely empty. It felt fortified. He hadn't brought a damsel up the mountain to save. He had brought a partner to hold the line. Grease build-up on the iron stove gave off a sharp, rancid odor that clung to everything they wore. By January, the cabin had become a sensory trap, thick with the smell of wood ash, unwashed wool, and the coppery tang of animal blood. Gideon sat on a low, three-legged stool near the hearth, working a fleshing knife over a stretched fox pelt. The rhythmic scrape-shh of the iron blade against the stiff hide was the only sound in the room. He worked methodically, stripping away the yellowed fat and translucent membrane. It was grueling, filthy work. He used to do it in a trance, his mind blissfully empty, listening only to the wind. Now the space hummed with an invisible, suffocating current. Clara sat across the narrow room, bathed in the weak grey light, fighting through the single scraped hide window Gideon had cut into the eastern wall. She was mending his spare canvas trousers. She didn't hum. She didn't sigh. She pulled the heavy waxed thread through the stiff fabric with a sharp, aggressive jerk, her jaw set. Her silence was louder than a shouting match. Gideon paused, the blade of his knife resting against the raw hide. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. He hated that he knew exactly how she breathed. He hated that he recognized the slight hesitation in her needlework when her blistered fingers cramped. His sanctuary was ruined. He had spent years building a fortress of absolute isolation, and she had dismantled it simply by existing within its walls. "Thread's rotting," Clara said abruptly, not looking up. "I'm doubling the stitch. It'll be thick, but it won't tear." "Fine," Gideon grunted. He went back to the pelt. Scrape-shh, scrape-shh. He expected her to stop there. She rarely spoke unless it concerned their immediate survival. But the needle paused mid-stitch. "You talk in your sleep," she noted. Her tone was clinical, detached. Gideon's grip on the knife handle tightened until his knuckles went pale. He didn't look at her. "No, I don't." "You do. You say a name." "Sarah." Clara bit off the end of the thread with her teeth, spitting the frayed tip onto the dirt floor. "You sound like you're trying to dig her out of the ground." The knife slipped. The sharp edge bit into the fox pelt, tearing a jagged 2-inch gash through the prime center of the fur. A ruined hide. A week's worth of coffee gone. Gideon didn't swear. He didn't throw the tool. He slowly lowered the knife to the dirt floor. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was heavy, violent and highly combustible. He finally lifted his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. They were entirely hollow, stripped of whatever humanity he usually managed to project. "You sew the pants," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, dangerous whisper. "You boil the water. You don't dig in my head." Clara met his stare. She didn't flinch, but her throat worked as she swallowed hard. She recognized a cornered animal. She folded the heavy canvas over her knee. "I'm not digging. I'm just telling you what I hear when the wind dies down." Gideon stood up, his massive frame eating up the cramped space of the cabin. He grabbed his heavy coat from the peg, shoving his arms into the sleeves. He didn't bother with his gloves. He unlatched the heavy timber door and shoved it open, stepping out into the biting sub-zero twilight. He stood in the snow for an hour, chopping frozen pine rounds into kindling until his lungs burned and his bare hands were bleeding from splinters. He wanted the cold to freeze the anger out of him. He wanted to forget the sound of her voice saying that name. When he finally stepped back inside his boots caked in ice, the cabin was dark. The fire had been banked. Clara was curled on her side of the raised platform, facing the wall, bundled entirely beneath the heavy buffalo robe. Gideon walked to the stove, throwing 3 pieces of the freshly chopped wood onto the coals. He stood there, letting the heat thaw his numb fingers. A low hitching sound came from the bed. Gideon turned. Clara was shifting violently beneath the heavy furs. It wasn't the restless turning of someone trying to get warm. Her legs kicked out, striking the log wall with a heavy thud. She gasped a sharp, strangled sound like a woman drowning in dry air. "Clara," Gideon said roughly. She didn't wake. She curled into a tight, trembling ball, her fingers clawing desperately at the edge of the robe. "Don't!" She whimpered the word, raw and broken. "Miller, please. I don't have it. I don't—" Gideon felt a cold, hard knot form in his gut. It wasn't pity. Pity was useless. It was a vicious, protective rage that he had no business feeling. He crossed the dirt floor in 2 strides. He didn't try to be gentle. He grabbed her shoulder through the thick hide and shook her hard. "Clara, wake up." She exploded upward. Her arm swung out blindly, her closed fist catching Gideon hard on the cheekbone. The blow rocked his head back. Before he could react, she was scrambling backward against the rough logs, her breath coming in ragged, tearing sobs, her eyes wide and completely unseeing in the dim light. "Stop!" Gideon barked, catching both of her wrists in one of his massive hands. He pinned them to her chest, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to hold her entirely still. "Look at me!" She thrashed her bare feet, kicking at his shins. She was entirely lost in the memory of the back room, the smell of kerosene, the heavy hands of a man collecting a debt in flesh. Clara," Gideon repeated, lowering his voice, forcing it to rumble deep in his chest. He leaned closer, letting her feel the rough, calloused texture of his hands, the smell of pine pitch and cold air radiating off his coat. "You are on the ridge. You are at 10,000 feet. Miller isn't here." Her struggling slowed. Her slate eyes blinked, the wild, panicked glaze slowly fracturing. She focused on his face, the harsh angles illuminated by the low firelight. She felt his grip on her wrists, unyielding, but entirely lacking the cruel, tearing intent she had been fighting in her sleep. She stopped fighting. Her shoulders slumped against the logs. She didn't cry, but her entire body shook with the violent aftermath of adrenaline. Gideon immediately released her wrists and stepped back. He put 2 feet of distance between them, wiping a smudge of dirt from his jaw where she had hit him. "He's not here," Gideon repeated flatly. Clara pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. She looked at her trembling hands. Not yet. Water dripped from the eaves. It was a slow, agonizingly erratic sound plink. Plink. But to Gideon it sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. The snowpack was rotting from the bottom up. Dark, muddy earth bled through the white crust near the pines. The air lost its throat-slitting edge, smelling now of damp moss and wet granite. Spring was an infection spreading up the mountain. They were out of flour down to the last handful of dried beans surviving on a stringy badger Gideon had trapped days prior. Winter had bled them dry. Gideon stood by the open door, staring down the jagged slope. The pass would be clear of snowdrifts in 2 weeks. A horse could make it up. A determined posse certainly could. He turned back. Clara was scrubbing the iron skillet with river sand. She looked thinner, the heavy wool shirt hanging loose on her frame, but the hollow, defeated look she carried up the mountain was gone. Her movements were sharp and violently efficient. Gideon walked to his wooden supply crate, reaching past the cedar box holding his watch. His hand closed around heavy oiled canvas. He pulled it out and set it on the butchering block. Clara stopped scrubbing. She watched his hands unroll the fabric. It was a Colt Dragoon, a massive, terrifying piece of iron and wood weighing over 4 pounds. It was a cavalry weapon designed to drop a horse at 50 paces. Beside it lay a powder flask, percussion caps, and a pouch of heavy lead balls. "Leave the pan," Gideon ordered. Clara wiped her gritty hands on her apron and walked over. It smelled sharply of gun oil and sulphur. "You going hunting?" "No." He picked up the heavy revolver, checking the loading lever. The heavy metallic click echoed in the damp cabin. "You are." Clara looked from the gun to his face. "I've never fired anything bigger than a rimfire squirrel rifle. That thing will snap my wrist. If you hold it wrong, it will—" Gideon agreed. He didn't offer a smaller gun. "Miller won't come alone. He'll bring Hiram, maybe deputies. If they catch me on the trap line or put a bullet through the door, you need to be able to drop a man in a thick coat." He held the gun out to her grip first. Clara stared at it. Taking the weapon meant acknowledging Gideon might fail. It meant acknowledging her survival was entirely her own bloody responsibility. She wiped her palms on her skirt and took it. Her arm instantly dropped an inch under the sheer weight. "Outside," Gideon said. They walked to a clearing 50 yards out, standing in ankle-deep slushy mud. Gideon set up a rotting pine stump against a snowbank. He walked back to where Clara stood shivering in the damp wind. He took the gun, loading a single chamber. Powder, ball, rammer, cap. His movements were a blur of practiced muscle memory. He handed it back. "Hold it with both hands," he instructed, stepping directly behind her. "Don't lock your elbows. The recoil needs somewhere to go, or it shatters your shoulder bones." Clara raised the iron. It wavered the barrel, drawing erratic circles. "It's too heavy." She gritted out, arms shaking. Gideon stepped closer. He reached around her, his calloused hands closing firmly over hers. His chest brushed against her back. The smell of him wood smoke, sweat, wet leather enveloped her. Clara flinched, a residual panic from the mercantile flaring, but his grip wasn't crushing. It was structural. He forced her arms to lower slightly, bending her elbows into a rigid but flexible frame. "Breathe in," Gideon commanded, his voice a low rumble vibrating against her spine. She took a shaky breath of the cold air. "Let half out. Hold it. Pull the hammer back with your thumb." She strained her thumb, slipping twice on the knurled metal before the hammer clicked into a locked position. The trigger tension was terrifying. "Don't yank it. Squeeze it like squeezing water from a sponge," Gideon said. He pulled his hands away, stepping back. "Whenever you're ready." Clara stared at the stump. It wasn't wood. It was Miller's chest, the crushing weight of her uncle's debt, the suffocating dirt of her husband's grave. She squeezed. The explosion was deafening. A cloud of acrid white smoke erupted from the barrel. The recoil punched backward like a kicking mule, throwing her arms high and driving her right foot into the mud to keep from falling. Her ears rang with a shrieking pitch. When the smoke cleared, the stump stood perfectly intact. A spray of mud marked where the heavy ball buried itself in the snowbank 2 feet left. Clara lowered the smoking gun. Her right hand vibrated. A bruised ache blossomed between her thumb and forefinger. She tasted bile. "I missed." Gideon didn't mock her. He walked forward, took the gun from her shaking hands, and began reloading. "You closed your eyes right before the break." He noted his voice entirely devoid of judgment. He handed it back. "You don't get to close your eyes. You watch the man die. Again." They stayed in the freezing mud for 2 hours. Clara fired until her shoulder felt hit by a sledgehammer, until her face was speckled with powder burns, until she couldn't hear the dripping eaves over the ringing in her head. On the 12th shot, the lead ball struck the center of the rotting stump with a hollow thwack, sending wet splinters into the snow. Clara lowered the weapon, panting hands stained black with soot. She turned to look at Gideon. He leaned against a ponderosa. He didn't look like a savior or a captor. He looked at her with quiet, grim respect, the respect reserved for men who survived the high ridge. "Keep it loaded," Gideon said, turning back toward the cabin. "Keep it under your pillow." Clara watched him walk away, the dragoon hanging at her side. The fear of Miller hadn't vanished, but it fundamentally changed. She was no longer a rabbit waiting for the snare. She had teeth. The mud smelled like copper and rotting pine needles. May brought a violent thaw, turning the steep trail into a slippery, treacherous artery connecting the ridge to Bitter Creek. Gideon hated spring. It meant the world could reach him again. He was splitting the last of the winter deadfall when the blue jays went silent. Gideon paused, the heavy maul resting on the scarred chopping block. He listened. Beneath the rush of snowmelt in the creek he heard it. The unmistakable rhythmic squelch of hooves fighting uphill in deep mud. Leather creaking under heavy riders. He didn't run. Panic was for prey. He quietly set the maul down and picked up the Winchester leaning against the cabin wall. He racked a shell into the chamber. The metallic clack-clack was loud enough to carry through the open door. Clara stepped into the threshold. She held a tin bucket of ashes. She saw Gideon's posture, the rigid line of his shoulders, the rifle gripped tight against his thigh. She didn't ask. She dropped the bucket. It clattered against the stone hearth. She turned back into the shadows of the cabin. 3 riders breached the tree line. Miller rode point. He looked heavier, his canvas duster stained with months of saloon grease and trail dirt. Behind him rode Hiram, looking miserable and terrified, clutching the reins of a rented roan. The third man was a stranger, a hired gun with a narrow face and a shotgun resting casually across his saddle horn. They stopped 30 yards out. The horses blew hard flanks, heaving vapor rising from their wet coats. Miller spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the slush. He looked at the cabin, the smoke, and finally at Gideon. He smiled. It was a wet, ugly expression. "Long ride up, mountain man," Miller called out. His voice echoed off the granite peaks. Gideon stood perfectly still by the chopping block. "Ride back down. I'm here for my property," Miller said, shifting his bulk in the saddle. "She owes a debt. You harboring her makes you party to theft. Town law says I can collect. Town law stops at the tree line," Gideon replied. His voice was a flat, dead calm. He raised the Winchester, the barrel resting level with Miller's chest. "Next man who kicks a horse forward dies." The hired gun laughed, a short, scraping sound. He swung the shotgun up. It happened in a fraction of a second. Gideon didn't wait to see the flash of the scattergun. He dropped to a knee, firing from the hip. The Winchester roared. The hired gun jerked violently, his shoulder blooming red, his shotgun discharging wildly into the pine branches above as he tumbled backward off his horse. Miller cursed, drawing his sidearm. Hiram screamed and spurred his horse around, fleeing blindly back down the treacherous trail. Gunfire shattered the mountain silence. Splinters exploded from the chopping block as Miller's first shot missed Gideon's head by inches. Gideon jacked another round, but the lever jammed a warped casing from a bad batch of brass. He swore, tossing the useless rifle aside, and lunged for the cover of the woodpile, drawing his Colt. Mud sprayed across his face as Miller fired again, the bullet burying itself in the stacked pine. "You're out of your depth, trapper," Miller roared, kicking his horse forward, closing the distance. He had the high ground. He had the angle. He leveled his revolver at the gap in the woodpile where Gideon was pinned. The heavy timber door of the cabin swung wide open. Miller didn't even look. He assumed she was cowering. He assumed she was beaten. Clara stepped into the blinding morning light. She didn't shout. She didn't hesitate. She stood exactly as Gideon had taught her, feet planted in the slush elbows, slightly bent, both hands gripping the massive iron dragoon. Miller caught the movement in his periphery. He turned, his eyes widening as he registered the size of the weapon in her hands. He swung his gun toward her. Clara didn't close her eyes. She squeezed the trigger. The dragoon detonated with the force of a cannon. A 3-foot tongue of flame and thick white smoke erupted from the muzzle. The recoil threw Clara back a step, her boots sliding in the mud, but she kept her footing. The heavy lead ball caught Miller square in the chest. It didn't just knock him off his horse, it lifted his massive frame backward, tearing him from the saddle. He hit the ground with a sickening wet thud, sliding 2 feet in the slush before coming to a complete stop. His horse reared, panicked by the explosion, and bolted into the trees. Silence slammed back down on the clearing heavier than before. The ringing in Clara's ears was absolute. The acrid smell of black powder burned her nose. She stood frozen, the heavy dragoon smoking in her hands, her chest heaving. She stared at the crumpled, motionless mass of canvas in the mud. Slowly, the crunch of boots broke through the ringing. Gideon stepped out from behind the woodpile. He didn't look at Miller. He walked straight to Clara. He reached out and gently took the heavy revolver from her shaking hands. He uncocked the hammer and let his arm drop to his side. Clara looked up at him. Her face was pale, smeared with soot, her grey eyes wide and searching. She was waiting for the revulsion. She was waiting for him to look at her, the way the town did, as something broken, something violent. Gideon didn't. He looked at her bruised hands, the mud on her boots, the fierce, terrifying will to live that radiated from her bones. He raised his free hand and wiped a smudge of black powder from her cheekbone with his thumb. The calloused skin scraped against hers. It wasn't a gentle touch, but it was incredibly anchoring. "Fire's getting low," Gideon said quietly, his voice a rough rumble. Clara swallowed hard, the tension in her jaw slowly uncoiling. She nodded once. "I'll fetch the wood." They didn't embrace. They didn't declare their salvation. They simply turned their backs on the dead world bleeding out in the mud and walked together back into the cabin they had held. Survival in the high country isn't built on grand speeches or perfect heroes. It is earned by flawed, desperate people finding strength in the frozen dirt and in each other. Gideon and Clara didn't find a fairy tale. They found a partnership forged in gunpowder winter ice and an unyielding will to live. If this gritty journey resonated with you, please hit that like button, share this video with fellow fans of grounded storytelling, and subscribe to the channel for more raw, authentic Western dramas. Your support keeps these deeply human stories alive. Drop a comment below.